Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history down this lane of memories.
Down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. 2 weeks after the budget was announced, can we take a considered view of it? Is the finance minister right in saying she can see green shoots, or is she literally seeing things? And a year later, what will be the state of the Indian economy? Those are three issues I shall raise today with India's former Chief Statistician and the Chairman of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics, Professor Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, we've had 2 weeks to consider the budget, so let me ask you, in a period of perceived economic crisis, is this the budget the country needs?
Well, in my opinion, of course, opinions differ. In my opinion, no. We needed, I think, a much bolder budget. If you actually look at the budget fairly carefully, it's really tinkering at the margins. I mean, it was a long speech, nearly 3 hours long, but most of it was really elaborating on a lot of initiatives that have been around for a while.
So then let me ask you this, and I'll come to the budget in a moment's time. But shortly after the budget was announced, the finance minister said, and I'm quoting, there are 7 important indicators which show that there are green shoots in the economy. She cited FDI and FPI investments, the index of industrial production, purchasing managers' indices, foreign reserves and tax collections. Do you agree with her? Or has she been proven wrong by the fact that shortly after she spoke, the index of industrial production once again nosedived into the negative
territory? Well, you can take them one by one. As far as the IIP is concerned, the IIP has been hanging around the zero mark for the longest time. It sometimes goes up a little bit, then it comes down into negative territory, and it's been yo-yoing back and forth. Now, if every time it goes into positive territory, you call it a green shoot, then we've had a whole bunch of green shoots along the way.
But all stunted.
All stunted. In fact, they actually perished the month after. The PMI is interesting because the PMI is one data set that is heavily quoted but has not shown to be particularly well correlated with what's happening to the economy. So it's still, as far as I can make out, work in progress, and I think we need to go far beyond to.
Business Standard points out in its editorial today, increases in FPI are nothing to do with confidence in the economy, they're to do with global flexibility of money and liquidity of money, and equally, increases in FDI may be simply because of the fact that increases in your foreign reserves may be simply because of the fact that you're actually selling the rupee to be able to keep the price down.
This is the point. The increase in the reserves really is something which should have happened a long time ago. We allowed the rupee to depreciate too far before we started intervening and buying. Now, I understand RBI's problem with that because the danger is that if you go too aggressive on dollar purchases, you'll have Mr. Trump calling you a currency manipulator. And that's not something that we really want to do. So we've been a little cautious on that, I think too cautious. So the rupee has appreciated too far, it's affecting our exports, and that's not a good place to be.
So the so-called green shoots that the finance minister has seen, you're saying to me, are either short-lived blips in the IIP, which have often perished, or they are to do with other things and not the health of the Indian economy. She can't draw much solace, leave aside confidence from these unless she wants to mislead herself.
Well, no, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we all need to live with hope. And if these give you hope, that's not a bad thing to have.
All right, she's giving herself hope.
Yes.
That's not a very confident assessment of what she said. It's simply a way of reassuring herself.
Yes, which means she'll hopefully wait till next year, next month, to see whether, see, at the end of the day, when you're talking about green shoots, you should be looking at trends. Is there a direction that you can see? If it's moving up and down month on month or quarter on quarter, that doesn't really signify.
That clear direction is missing
not
at
yet
the
there.
moment.
Yes.
Let's then come back at this point to the budget. Now, the key requirement when she announced the budget was to boost growth, which is possibly going to dip below 5% this year. The finance minister has partly done so by cutting income tax rates for those who avail of the new regime, but she's basically relied upon boosting growth by pushing up investment. Was that the right decision, or should she have sought to boost demand through consumption?
Well, you know, as I said, investment is not a bad way to boost demand. But the speed with which an investment project translates into increased consumption demand depends upon the nature of that investment. So if you're talking about large projects, that takes long. If you're talking about projects which are capital intensive in nature, so like airports and superhighways and things of that kind, which are essentially mechanized, it doesn't add that much to consumption. But if you're looking at investment projects which are essentially labor intensive in nature, where you're using people to construct things, then the translation is very quick. So it much depends upon the nature of, and we don't know what that pattern is going to be until it starts playing out.
In an interview you gave me in January, roughly about 5 weeks ago, you said very clearly that the major focus of the budget should be in boosting consumption, and you said if to do so, the fiscal deficit increases to 5.5, that shouldn't deter her, because she needs to ensure this extra money goes to NREGA, PM Kisan and rural roads. Do you think she's followed that sort of line of logic and thinking?
No, in fact, all three have gone down. If you look at the budget, all three have actually been reduced.
And what message does that send when all three get reduced? That she's not really boosting demand, she's not putting money in the pockets of those who spend?
She is boosting demand supposedly through the investment side. And as I said, that's all right.
But it'll take time.
Well, it depends on what kind of investment and how quickly you can get on with it.
And that we don't know.
That we do not know.
So you can't come to an opinion about the strategy to boost demand by boosting investment until you know what kind of investment she has in mind, which in turn will tell you how quickly it will boost demand, whether it's short term, medium term or long term. So therefore, there are question marks about the legitimacy and accuracy of her strategy, which can only be answered when she tells us what sort of investment she has in mind.
Well, I don't think that is entirely in her hands, because there is an investment pipeline that they're looking at. Now, what's in that, there's a whole bunch of things in the pipeline. The process of choosing which are the projects you're going to take forward is really the issue. But you also have to remember something else, Karan. PMGSY and MNREGA are both investment expenditures. Those are not consumption expenditures. MNREGA builds rural infrastructure, and PMGSY constructs village roads. So,
one of the problems, as you pointed out, of relying mainly on investment rather than boosting consumption to get growth is that it's possible things could happen after a time frame of a year or two or three.
Or even longer.
Or even longer. But the crisis we face is today. And she needs to immediately boost growth, because otherwise it will go into a sort of tailspin. Given that the immediate is the problem, not the middle term, should she have concentrated on boosting growth through boosting consumption, which she hasn't done?
well, again, as far as consumption is concerned, again, you need to be a little careful. Because if we are talking about a large boost, which we did, if you remember, in 2008-9, when Pranab Mukherjee had given this massive increase in the fiscal deficit, unfortunately, we were unable to roll those initiatives back when things picked up. And then we suffered damage because of that. The advantage of investments is that they're easier to switch off than direct consumption transfers.
But this is very interesting. Are you therefore suggesting, perhaps a little different to what you said in January, that she was perhaps right in not letting the fiscal deficit go officially
No,
above 3.5?
I will stand by what I said then.
That it should have
It should have gone up higher
to 5.5, which is what you said.
if needed, because as I said, there are a lot of dues that the government owes. Now, in a sense, if you took it to 5.5, you'd be in a position to pay those dues off. You'd be able to pay the states off. You'd be able to pay your PSUs off. So if you look at FCI, it's in a deep hole. You'd be able to pay off various beneficiaries who are not getting transfers. You'd be able to hand out your GST
and all
refunds.
of this would have boosted consumption which would have in turn given a fillip
right.
to production
That's right.
and produced growth.
Yeah.
So you're suggesting that with the short term in mind, she actually hasn't taken the right decision.
No, that's what I'm essentially trying to hint at, that a one-time correction. So if you think about what I was talking about in terms of 5.5% fiscal deficit, I was saying you're paying off your dues, which means that next year you would not have to have a budget which would be, let's say, 5. You could have a budget which would be 3.5 because you'd have paid your dues off. You'd be working on a clean slate.
I'm coming to the feeling that what you're saying is that given that the immediate was the problem, the decision she's taken was not the right one. She should have perhaps concentrated more on boosting consumption. Not that she shouldn't have done anything in terms of investment, but the stress should not have been on investment, the stress should have been on consumption.
No, the stress should have been on consumption, but as I said, consumption driven by particular kinds of expenditures. So if you think of things like Manrega, Manrega is an investment activity, but it leads to immediate consumption. Gram Sadak Yojana is an investment activity, leads to immediate consumption. But on the other hand, if you take something like PM Kisan, and supposing you had doubled the outlay on PM Kisan, once that is done, so you take it from 6,000 rupees a year to, let's say, to 12,000 rupees, you cannot roll it back ever, because that is politically
But again,
infeasible.
what you put into PM Kisan would lead immediately to consumption,
It
that
would
would lead to
indeed.
production. So if your problem at the moment is to boost growth, spending on NREGA, spending on PM Kisan, spending on Gram Sadak, spending in fact on rural roads would have pushed through money into the hands of those who spent it. That would have increased demand, that would increase production, and would have brought growth.
Yes, but again, as I said, you need to be careful as to how you do it. So if you're talking about PM Kisan as we were, the choice would be between increasing the amount from 6,000 to, let's say, 12,000, or expanding the coverage, getting all the farmers covered.
Which would you prefer?
I would prefer the latter.
The truth is that on all three that we're mentioning, allocations have either stayed the same or they've come
Or
down.
they've shrunk.
NREGA has come down by 9,500 crore.
That's right.
PM Kisan is the same as it was last year.
That's right.
Except that last year they didn't spend it, they fell short by something like 13,000 crore. And the truth is, if you look at the overall allocations for agriculture and rural development, comparing BE to BE, they've only increased by 2.6%, which is considerably lower than inflation. So where money was needed to boost consumption, she either hasn't put it or she's kept it at the same level, but an opportunity to boost consumption has as a result been missed.
Well, look, this opportunity comes over and over again. The question is that does the economy need to suffer a more extended period of slowdown than was necessary?
You're again saying that that period of slowdown, that suffering will continue for longer than necessary.
That's
and
right.
this is because she didn't put sufficient stress on consumption.
At the moment.
At the moment. Which means that actually then, if the short-term crisis is what she was trying to tackle, she's done it either inadequately and imperfectly by stressing on investment rather than consumption.
Well, yeah, I think that there are optics involved in that. As far as the sort of the official narrative is concerned, it has been, and it's been from last year, in fact, that it's investments which drive growth.
And you're saying that's not always the case.
That's not
in the
always
short
the
term,
case.
particularly.
That's right.
And therefore, she's been trapped by the official narrative that investments drive growth, whereas in fact in a crisis situation it's
It's
consumption.
consumption which is needed in this particular.
Now the argument that she's put forward, that she didn't have the fiscal space, is one that you've already said you don't accept. This year, because it's a crisis year, as you said in January, she could have let the fiscal deficit go all the way to 5.5, provided the money was spent on things like PM Kisan, NREGA, Gram Sadak, and of course rural roads.
And cleaning up the balance sheet of all your creditors.
Let's come at this point to what she has done in terms of investment. And I want to ask you, even in terms of her own thinking, has she done enough or is it inadequate? Now, to begin with, PM Gram Sadak has got a new allocation additionally of 5,000 crore, and I believe it is something like 38% compared to last year's RE. And rural housing too has got an additional 1,000 crore. And this is clearly in line with your thinking. But the question is it sufficient? Should she have done more?
These are small numbers. These are very small numbers. You know, 5,000 crores at best, if it leverages itself, can translate into an income growth of 15,000 crores. In an economy of our size, that goes into the second or third place of decimal.
So in other words, even in terms of her claim that she's boosting growth by pushing investment, at least on these two fronts, rural housing and rural roads, what she's done is very small, close to insignificant.
They are smaller.
Her bigger promise was that she would spend over 100 lakh crore on infrastructure over the next 4 years, and the truth is she made that promise in July as well. Now if you look at the details of the budget, no doubt government capex has gone up by 18%, but I noticed that the actual allocation for infrastructure is just 12,500 crore. So is this an instance where the resources don't actually match up to the rhetoric?
Well, you know, the rhetoric has a little bit of, one shouldn't call it a fudge, but a little bit of gilding, as it were, which is when you report the investment number, you're doing two things. First, you're not saying that all that investment is going to be public investment. That's investment in total. So you could have half of that coming from the private sector, or even more.
We just don't know.
We just don't know, and what is being done about it. The second is that normally the public funds would provide the, as it were, the equity, and then you could leverage it 3-4 times through borrowings by whatever is the special purpose vehicle that gets set up for doing the work. So the numbers, and in terms of the target of 1 lakh crores or whatever it is, and what is being allocated, have this difference built into them. And so you can't compare those on a.
This is very interesting. You're saying we're all captivated by that number, that over 100 lakh crore will be spent in 4 years on infrastructure, but we don't know, and she hasn't revealed how much will come from the government. So we're captivated by the number without knowing the details. And in terms of actual allocations, there looks as if there is a huge mismatch between the gilding of the rhetoric and the actual money on the ground.
Well, yes, you know, it wouldn't have been so bad if we were at least aware of what measures were being taken to attract private investments in infrastructure. You know, we've been through a bad experience with that.
But she's talked about giving concessions to sovereign funds. She's made it easier for FPIs as well as other corporates to invest in government securities.
No, that doesn't help.
No,
that doesn't help very much at all. In fact, I think it is kind of pointless. All it does is it increases the demand for government bonds and reduces the interest rate on it. So that's all it does. So I wouldn't take that terribly seriously. But you think of what was the kind of problem we had. We had a fairly substantial sort of growth of investment in infrastructure during the high growth years, a lot of which was funded by the private sector through the BOT route. But that model broke down because there were infirmities in the kind of contracts that the government signed with the private developers. Now, if you're serious about getting this kind of investment in infrastructure. You're going to have to get the private sector in, which means you have to have a game plan as to how you're going to do it,
Which she doesn't have.
which we have not heard of as yet.
So this is a second minus. The first is that we don't know how much of that 100 crore will come from the government, how much she thinks she'll attract from the private sector. And the second minus, if I can use that word, is we don't know what's her game plan for getting the private sector involved. The old model has broken down. The old model.
The old model
you need a new one.
has broken down, is kind of discredited.
So you need a new one.
You need a new one, and this has been talked about for the last 5 years. I mean, it's not that this has not been on the drawing board, but we don't know what the
So
new
in
model
the
is.
absence of these critical details, actually that 100 crore figure to be invested over a period of the next 4 years remains just a figure and nothing more.
Well, as of now, unless there's already some kind of a blueprint that has been developed for attracting private investment.
Let's come back to that allocation of 18% increase for capital government capex. Now, Shankaracharya, former chief economic advisor, says that an 18% increase is no doubt substantial, but it's what you would expect in a normal year in a country like India. In a crisis year, you'd expect a lot more. And he says, even if you assume that the finance minister's belief that the right way to boost growth is by boosting investment, she simply hasn't put enough money behind her own thinking.
You know, that is hard to say, because the question I would really ask, and unfortunately I haven't done my homework on this one, is that if you are giving an 18% boost to the government capex, where have you cut? What are the line items on which you've made a cut? Okay, there is some moderation in the interest burden of the government, but if the cuts are on expenditures which directly feed into consumption,
It's even worse.
then you are actually not helping very much.
So not only is 18% not a large amount in a crisis year, it's just a normal amount, but if that is being countered by making cuts in expenditure, and that cuts in expenditure actually affect consumption, then you're not necessarily gaining through the
you may be
investment, you could be losing.
Yes.
And again, when you do your homework, you know which it is. But I imagine the fact that you're making this point is because you sense that she may have made cuts
Well,
that will undermine the
No,
investment.
it has to be, because if you have 18% increase in capex and you have an overall 7% increase in expenditures, there's a cut somewhere.
And that's likely to be on critical consumption, which will
Well, no. So it can be on the government's own operating costs. A cut in that, I mean, I would not be worried about. Or it could be on the things which are supporting consumption.
Well, it certainly will be, one cut will be NREGA, which has gone down by 9,500.
Which has gone down.
And we know that, for
By the
instance,
way,
PM
NREGA is usually classified as investment.
and so that's gone down. We know that PM Kisan hasn't gone up. And we know that the overall allocation for agriculture and rural development
Has gone down.
BE to B is only a 2.6% increase, which is way below inflation.
Well, in agriculture, if you take away PM Kisan, it's actually gone down.
So then, in fact, in a very real sense, she's financing her investment 18% growth in capex by cutting critical expenditure on consumption.
Quite possible.
So we're not going to gain, we could
really
lose.
have to look at those much more
Let's
carefully.
at this point come to what the finance minister believes will be the result at the end of the year. She's projecting a 10% nominal growth in GDP, which I presume could be somewhere around a 6% real growth. But given that nominal growth this year was just 7.5% and real growth is probably under 5%, is this projection for next year realistic?
I think it's optimistic, but there is nothing intrinsically wrong with being optimistic when you are making a budget. The real question is that supposing it doesn't materialize, supposing the 10% growth doesn't materialize and what you get is, let's say, an 8.5 or a 9% growth in GDP, then are you going to cut your expenditures further? So what is important is not what you've built into the budget. After you've made that assumption, you have then built in a whole bunch of expenditure commitments. Are you going to cut back on those? Because if you do, then you're making the problem even worse.
Let's approach that by looking at the projection she's got for gross tax revenue growth. On the back of a 10% increase in nominal GDP growth, She believes gross tax revenues will increase by 12%, which is a tax buoyancy of 1.2.
1.2.
And in turn, if you break that down further, she's assuming that GST will grow by 12.8% compared to just 5.8 this year, that corporate tax will grow at 11.5% compared to minus 8% this year, and income tax by 14%. Now, when you look at those revenue projections, do they look realistic?
On the revenue projections, I have some issues, yes.
So this is not just optimism. Here you're pretty close to suggesting you have issues, which means you think they are unrealistic.
You know, as I said, unrealistic to an extent, yes, but that's not my worry. As I said, much depends on how you adjust later. My worry is a different one, which is we have had now an extended period where the tax projections have been extremely ambitious and we have consistently fallen short. But what happens when you have high tax projections is that you give the tax collectors targets which they are forced to try and meet, and is one of the primary causes of what's called tax terrorism.
Which she's trying to counter by promising a taxpayer's charter, the details of which we don't know, but you're worried that these unrealistic targets will further push tax terrorism.
It will continue to push, it's not for.
And the promise of a charter is therefore being negated by the reality of the pressure you're putting on the taxman.
Well, it depends upon the nature of the charter. You know, the point is a charter, if it is only a statement of best intention, then it doesn't do much good in this particular situation where the taxman is under pressure. His promotion is at stake. It won't do much unless the charter builds in some kind of a fast-track recourse to perceived tax terrorism.
That will be critical.
If that is there, then it may make a difference.
So you're
but that may actually then militate against collection of taxes.
So she's caught in a dilemma.
A little bit of dilemma. Yeah.
But you're making a very interesting point. The promise of ameliorating tax terrorism by giving us a taxpayer's charter seems to be contradicted by the unrealistic revenue target she's setting, which will put pressure on the taxman to achieve them. And unless she has some fast-track recourse in the charter to remedy injustices done to taxpayers, then the charter itself will be just good intention and nothing more. A lot of the budget, of course, depends upon the realization of the 2.1 lakh crore disinvestment target. Now, given that the most she can achieve this year is 65,000 crore, is it realistic to believe that she'll get more than 3 times next year?
We don't know. Much will depend upon whether or not the government can attract foreign investors in Air India and in BPCL.
What's your feeling?
BPCL, it should be possible. But again, you know, there are processes and the global petroleum markets doesn't look very rosy at the moment.
What about Air India, where she's put a
Air
cap of
India,
49% on foreign control?
We don't know about Air India.
Could that 49% cap on foreign running of the airline be a problem?
It could, because I don't see any Indian airlines having or any Indian operator having the bandwidth to be able to take on Air India.
And why would a foreigner invest if they can't run the airline completely as they want?
This is correct.
So that's why Air India is a big question mark.
Is a question.
What about LIC? A lot rides on
You
LIC.
see, LIC is a different ballgame because, you know, in LIC you're not doing a strategic sale. What you're doing is you're offloading LIC shares on the market. Now, in a situation where we are seeing very few IPOs coming into the share market, LIC shares may actually get snapped up pretty quickly.
What about the fact that before they are snapped up, she needs to amend the LIC Act, and LIC also has to become in line with SEBI rules and regulations. Can all of that be done in a year? Is there a danger it may not happen?
There is a danger it may not happen because systems will have to be changed. They will have to satisfy the conditions that have been laid down by SEBI for listing.
Which are not necessarily easy or straightforward.
Which are not easy or straightforward to.
So we're coming to a very interesting conclusion at this point. Her projections for growth are optimistic. Many of her projections for tax revenue are pretty close to unrealistic. Who knows whether her disinvestment will be realized or not, but chances are that some of it may not be. In which case, her 3.5% official fiscal deficit target, I presume, goes out of the window. And at that point, the mathematics on which this budget is based becomes awry.
Yes. Now, as we know, these mathematics have systematically gone awry for the last 3 years or so. And so far, efforts have been made essentially to keep kicking the can down the road. This is the first time some acknowledgement has been made by allowing the fiscal deficit to go up by 0.5% of GDP.
And also because she's publicized the off-budget items.
And the off-budget items. So some progress there. So this is nothing new. The question is, how far can you keep kicking the can down the road without collateral damage to the economy?
Then let me ask you, given the concerns we've expressed, given the real possibility that the mathematics of this budget could go awry, what would be the state of the Indian economy 1 year down the road in March 2021?
You know, you still have people talking about a 6% growth for 2021, which means that if you're really looking at the last quarter of 2021, you should be looking at 6.5 plus. That is very unlikely to happen.
What do you think is the likely growth this year? The year starting 1st April.
I would say that if you get around 5.5, you should be more than happy.
And what do you think would be the impact on the lives of people and on, more importantly, the animal spirits that fuel investment? Do you think consumption is likely to gently but steadily rise? Do you think that's unlikely?
No, I think consumption is likely to rise. See, again, there are some issues which we need to take on board. The first is that after a long time, we've seen a spike in food inflation. And nobody's really asking the question what it signifies.
What is it?
Well, you know, one of the reasons why food inflation has been so muted and indeed in the negative territory is the fact that there was simply not enough liquidity in the agri markets. And this has been the post-demonetization experience, and it's been going on and on and on. Now that you've seen this rise going up, it may be signaling that some of that liquidity has come back and may keep coming back.
And is the farmer earning more as a result? Is his income
In
going
the
up?
initial stage, I don't think so, because I think in the initial stage when the onion prices went up, this was purely profiteering by the traders.
But thereafter?
But thereafter, the farmers would be benefiting, because remember, when the trader profiteers, he's getting cash. He then has higher levels of liquidity so that the next crop that comes in, he can afford to pay more, which wasn't the case earlier. So we may be seeing green shoots there in agriculture, and the agricultural market in particular, not the green shoots that
She talked about. But you do see some prospect of green shoots in the agricultural market.
I am hoping.
And through farmer salaries. And so that's the hope for consumption over the next year picking up. What about animal spirits and investors?
Animal spirits will come later. At the moment, it's down.
At the moment, it's down.
It's really
and you
down.
don't think what she's done in the budget is going to kick it up and spark it up?
It's not going to spark it up at all.
Let's take a break at that point. When I come back, I want to talk about problems the budget hasn't really focused upon, prescriptions that could be possibly wrong, and claims that may be simply unbelievable. But first, a message from our sponsor, Glenlivet, as I take a cheering sip from this glass.
Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is India's former Chief Statistician and the Chairman of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics, Professor Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, let me start with a couple of problems that perhaps the budget hasn't tackled at all. The first is unemployment. The Center for Managing the Indian Economy says that the average unemployment rate during the year that's ending was 7.4% each single month. And that's pretty high for India. Can you see anything in the budget that substantially tackles this problem of unemployment?
No. If you think about it, the whole unemployment issue really revolves around what is happening to the non-corporate sector, which we call the informal sector in casual conversation. The problem, of course, is we don't have data on it. We did know, for instance, like we talked about, about the agricultural market and the trader class, that perhaps there are green shoots there. But for the rest of the non-corporate sector, there is nothing in the budget which really gives them any hope. I realize that it's not easy for the government to directly address that class of producers. But until we see dynamism at that level, you're not going to see employment increasing very
So the
much.
unemployment levels in the unorganized sector, which shot up after demonetization, are likely to stay up, and the sense of pain and suffering that people have when they're unemployed is likely to continue.
Quite possibly. You know, one of the things that the government had done for this sector was the mudra loans. Now, we don't quite know what the status of those loans are, and there's a very large amount which is locked up there, because the government has actually ordered the banks not to do recognition as NPLs until 1st of April, when the process begins. Now, when the recognition, asset recognition starts by the banks, if we find a lot of mudra loans have turned bad, then we are in a fairly deep soup.
And that will, of course, affect the public sector banking system.
It will affect the public sector
But before I
banking.
come to that, let me, on mudra loans, ask you this. The Prime Minister believes that mudra loans have created self-employment, and he believes it's created a very large level of self-employment. Do you accept that?
Well, there is a study. The government commissioned a study on this, which was done by the Labour Bureau. The results came out last year sometime, fairly early last year. I think it was April or May or something, which suggested that over a 2.5-year period, mudra loans had created 11 million jobs.
Which, if true, is fantastic.
Which, if true, is very. No, I have no reason to be. It's a good survey. The problem, of course, is that that particular report is not in public domain.
Which worries you?
Which worries me.
Because if it is correct and it's something the government should be proud of, they should have published it.
They should have
And if
published
they haven't published it, then you wonder whether the claims being made are true.
We don't know.
Well, let
so
me
we
bring-
only know through leaks.
Let me bring up youth unemployment in particular, because surveys done pretty recently suggest that youth unemployment has jumped from 9 million in 2011-12 to around 25 million in 17-18. And separately, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy says that today, the rate of unemployment for youth is 31%, which is astonishing. Yet in her budget speech, the Finance Minister said India's youth are no longer job seekers, they've become job creators. Do you really believe that if people have become job creators, you can have at the same time, side by side, a 31% youth unemployment rate? Or is she in some form of denial of the problem?
No, I think the youth unemployment problem is serious, because I've seen the data, and what it suggests is that the unemployment rate, which, as you said, is about 31% for the youth, drops off sharply after that, and it really goes down into the 3, 4, 5% levels, or even less, which seems to suggest that the whole problem with employment is really youth employment. It's not employment of the older people. So if you think of where the older people are getting work from, since there don't seem to be that many jobs being created, I suspect the older people are the ones who've actually gone into self-employment.
And the youth
So
are
it's-
unemployed.
The youth are still looking for jobs, And it's only when they get to a point where they give up on getting a job that they may turn to self-employment. Because it's the people who are in their 30s who seem to have turned.
Which means that when she says youth have become job creators, they're not job seekers, she's actually, in a very real sense, denying the problem that exists. They are job seekers, they're desperate for jobs.
Well, it depends who you mean by youth. You know, at my age, for instance, a 35-year-old is youth. He's a job.
From the perspective of her age, she may have misunderstood what is youth. That's a very gentlemanly way of putting it. Let's come to a second issue that the budget seems to have ignored. The problem of public sector banks, and now the problem of NBFCs. There's no allocation for recapitalization other than IDBI. No bank is listed for disinvestment or privatization, and there's nothing about granting greater autonomy or independence to management. So has she sidestepped this problem?
This is a larger issue, actually, Karan, and it's something we need to think about very carefully. Because what has happened is, for one reason or the other, the financial architecture that had been built up for a while, we had gone through some very bad patches in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then there's been pretty much a sort of constant trend towards improvement in our financial architecture. That seems to have broken down again. Now, on this, there doesn't seem to be, again, a blueprint for fixing the problem.
You mean the government doesn't know what to do?
Well, it's not just the government. I mean, it's I think, facile to blame the government for everything. The financial sector itself doesn't have hard suggestions as to what should be done. Bailouts are, of course, the financial sector's default option. But the point is, we again need to ask the question of what is it that's going wrong and why is it going wrong?
You mean those fundamental questions, what's going wrong and why is it going wrong, haven't really been adequately or seriously asked?
And certainly not addressed, yes.
Which is why you say the country as a whole, not just the government, the country as a whole is at a loss what to do about public sector banks and NBFCs.
Yes, and as I said, the architecture, remember, these are not standalone sectors. NBFCs get a very large proportion of their funds from the banking sector itself. So there is an organic relationship between the various bits and pieces of the financial sector. And we need to be able to understand that and ask the question whether these linkages are working the way that they should be working.
But then you're saying a very serious thing. If we haven't asked the question what's gone wrong and why is it gone wrong, which are the two fundamental questions that need to be asked, and as a result of which, if the country as a whole is at a loss what to do, then the problem of public sector banks and NBFCs is going to stay with us and continue and possibly get worse over the next few years.
This is correct. Unless there is an exogenous thrust and the economy starts looking up, then a lot of these problems can take care of themselves. Simply, you know,
an exogenous thrust and the economy starts turning up sounds a bit like unless a miracle happens.
No, or the
because
government,
an exogenous thrust
or
is
the government spends more.
Oh, but it's not.
That's an exogenous thrust.
Yeah, but the government isn't spending more.
Well, it isn't.
And in the absence of the government spending more, this is another term for a miracle happening.
Well, yeah. Well,
yes.
If you're describing increased fiscal deficit as a miracle, the IMF would take umbrage.
No, I'm not. I'm simply saying that in the absence of an increased fiscal deficit and the government's determination to stick by 3.5, the exogenous thrust that you're talking about looks like a miracle.
At the moment it does, especially with the China problems. The global economy is hurting, whatever be the brave words, but the global economy is hurting. So, the external sector is not good.
Let's come at this point to a prescription that many people believe the government has got wrong. The finance minister has continued a tendency of the last couple of budgets to add to protectionist import substituting measures. A whole list of items have had tariffs increased. Now, she says she's done this to protect entrepreneurs, Indian entrepreneurs, from being dumped against. Economists like Shankaracharya and Arvind Panagre have said this is completely wrong, because this will actually retard any possibility of growth of Indian exports, and exports could have been another engine to boost growth. What's your feeling? Is she right or is she horribly wrong?
Politically, she didn't have much of a choice, I think.
Because traders were clamoring.
Basically what has happened is that over an extended period you have allowed the rupee to appreciate. We discussed this earlier. And given that kind of appreciation, we are talking about 16% appreciation over the last 3 years. No trader or no manufacturer can compete. So the choice that was facing the government is either depreciate the rupee or put in tariffs. Now, depreciation has the great advantage is that it simultaneously protects the import substituting sectors and gives a boost to exports, whereas a tariff just does only protection and may actually retard exports for all you know.
But then you're saying an interesting thing. Politically, she had no choice because the clamor from traders was becoming hard for her to ignore, particularly because those are BJP voters. But in terms of economic sense, she's still done the wrong thing.
Yes.
So politically right, but economically this is the wrong prescription.
That's right.
And it's particularly wrong because it will retard the possibility of the export sector growing, which could have boosted growth.
That's right.
And that's what she needed at the moment to boost growth. Finally, let's come to a claim, or two claims rather, that many believe are absolutely unbelievable. Once again, she's committed herself to doubling farmers' incomes by 2022, which means that agriculture has to grow over the next 3 years at 15% per year. And the Prime Minister, a couple of days later, has committed himself to the economy becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2024. Are either of those realistic claims given the state of the economy today and given the sort of policies we've seen in this budget?
Well, let me put it in terms of numbers. Doubling farmers' income, as you said, requires farm incomes to grow at 15%, which means if the production growth continues to be where it is, which is about 3% or slightly less, to get 15% farmers' income increase, you need agri prices to go at 12%. All right? Supposing food prices start climbing at 12%, across the board this has to happen. This is not just one or the other vegetable. You are then looking at and all other prices stay absolutely flat. Even then, you are looking at a 6% inflation. What will RBI do? It's going to clamp on the monetary brakes. They do not have a choice, and the economy will start tanking.
If I've understood correctly, you're suggesting a very interesting relationship. Steps that could possibly yield a doubling of farmers' income in 3 years would also kick up inflation to unacceptable levels of 6%. The RBI would start tightening on the interest rate, and that would mean the economy would tank. And so the realization of a doubling of farmers' income almost guarantees that you're not going to become a $5 trillion economy in 4 years' time. You can either achieve one or the other. Can she achieve the other? Can we become a $5 trillion economy if you do not double farmers' incomes?
I don't think so. I think you really need to look at them as in a sequence where farmers' income, not doubling necessarily, but getting farmers' incomes up should be the first phase of the sequence, and then generating high economic growth would be the second phase. So targets like doubling, I don't think we should get carried away with those. But at least let's get the incomes moving upwards.
But you're saying a very interesting thing. Even if, and there's a big even here, even if both of these are possible, they're not going to happen in 3 years and 4 years. It's going to take a lot longer, and you ought to get the sequencing right.
You have to get this.
And therefore give yourself a time horizon of maybe 5-6 years to achieve this target.
Well, let's forget about the doubling of the farmers' income. If I can get to a situation where I'm seeing a credible improvement in farmers' income, credible, mind you, which means the growth in farm output plus food inflation minus inflation of all other sectors. This has to be a credible, positive number. Until one sees that happening, the growth acceleration that we are talking about is not going to happen very strongly. It may happen a little bit, but nothing of the magnitude that you want.
So the first stage should be get a credible improvement in farmers' income. Forget doubling,
Forget
just
doubling,
a credible improvement.
That's right.
And when you get that credible improvement, then begin to imagine that you can reach a $5 trillion status. What basically and quickly is a credible improvement?
I would say that the real income of farmers should be growing at no less than 4 to 5%.
And what is it growing at the moment?
Well, at the moment, it had been going negative.
So you need an annual 4% to 5% increase in farmers' income.
That's right.
At this point,
And real incomes, mind you.
absolutely not inflation boosted. But even that looks pretty tough, because at the moment farmers' incomes are shrinking, and you're saying from a shrinking rate of growth to get to even 4 or 5% is not going to be easy. At this point, I'm going to completely change subjects and ask you a couple of questions as chairman of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics. It's no great secret, Professor Sen, that because of the prevailing atmosphere of mistrust and suspicion, several field enumerators working on official surveys have met with either resistance or in some instances even outright violence in at least 4 states. What impact will this have on NSS surveys, and what impact will it have on the census and the NPR happening next year?
The NPR is supposed to happen this year.
I beg your pardon, I meant this year. Yes.
This is a serious concern. This year, we are supposed to be doing the house listing operations for the census. And the house listing operation is the first critical step to the census itself. So what happens is, when you do a house listing, you then use that information to carve out non-intersecting enumerator blocks. So each enumerator is given a very specific geographic location which he or she has to cover. And this can only be done with the house listing operation. Now, the house listing operation asks a whole bunch of questions, but usually about the nature of the structure and some facilities like toilets and things like that. Nothing. What's the quality of the building? The problem is that since already in the public mind, the NPR is going to be carried on along with the house listing operations, any resistance towards the NPR is going to compromise the quality of the house listing, which would then mean that you would be starting off your census on possibly a bad footing. If because of that the census goes wrong, then every household survey for the next 11 years is gone.
Next 11 years?
Yes, till the next census.
Because those household surveys depend on an accurate census.
The census provides the basis in which we draw samples. The census provides the basis on which we extrapolate from the census results to from the sample results to the national level.
So
census is key to any survey that we do.
So the problem starts with the fact that the house listings operation is going to happen simultaneously, it seems, with the NPR.
That's right.
Doubts, suspicions and concerns about the NPR will feed into the house listing. If the house listing is done imperfectly, the census suffers. If the census suffers, the next 10 years of NSS surveys also suffer. What impact will that have on India's possibility to create accurate, sensible plans for development, which is vital for our government?
We'd be in deep trouble. You see, the one thing that up to now we never ever had an issue with was the census. You know, through all very difficult times, the census has been carried out without any resistance. This is the first time in my memory one is getting the feeling that the census may not go as smoothly as it should.
So what's your advice to the government? Don't carry out the NPR at the same time as the house listing. Otherwise, if you do, you'll compromise the house listing and in turn compromise the census. Is that your advice?
That is right.
So do not have an NPR at the moment.
You know, again, Karan, let me take you back. Remember, there was this demand for a caste census during the last census, and it was decided, and this was a parliament decision, And it was decided to have a separate caste census after the census was over. So census was done in 2011. The socioeconomic and caste census was done in 2012. Right? So you made sure that the census was not compromised.
Similarly, dissociate NPR.
NPR from the house listing and the census, do it later if you have to.
Do the NPR after the census. One other thing,
I'm not sure that that's going to work now.
because of the government's ideological commitment.
No, it's not the government's ideological commitment. The fact is that people now think that the NPR and the house listing operations are the same activity. We may have already lost the ball game.
It may already be too late
It may already be too
because
late.
of the
If that's
extent to which fear and suspicion has seeded itself into the system.
That's right.
One last question. If in these circumstances you find that the NPR and house listing is going to happen together, because the government seems to be committed to doing it, what then advice do you give to the enumerators when they get to the census stage? Should they, at that point, limit themselves to the most minimum questions and not be ambitious?
The problem is you cannot do the NPR without a fairly detailed set of questions. The house listing operation you can. House listing operation, I don't need a lot of information.
So if you do the NPR, you have to ask a lot of questions, which is another reason why don't do it now.
Yeah, because remember, NPR you have to ask it person by person. Whereas in a house listing operation, you're looking at a structure and you're simply asking, the main question you need to know is how many persons stay there on a normal basis.
The others are just additional.
Others are just additional if people are
What if
cooperative.
the NPR were done and that critical question, where were your parents born, what was their date of birth, is not asked? Would that improve the way the NPR is viewed, or is it
I
now
doubt
too late?
it.
It's too late.
I doubt it.
So we are really looking at a mess.
Unfortunately, yes, we are.
And that means our ability to undertake surveys on the basis of which we draw up plans and hope to develop is also, as you said earlier, in deep trouble.
Yes, it is seriously compromised.
Professor Sen, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.